In July of 1988, a county van, a bank pickup, and a seed company truck turned off Highway 5 and rolled down a washboard lane outside Centerville, Iowa. Dust rose behind them in a pale sheet. The men inside had come to inspect a failure. That was the word already being used in town, failure. A 38-acre failure behind a sagging red barn, where the crop should have been corn or beans, or at least something a man could sell without explaining himself. Instead, the field looked like weeds. Tall green stems, broad leaves, ragged seed heads moving in the hot wind. No clean rows, no sprayed edges, no proof that anybody with sense had planted it on purpose. At the fence stood a 74-year-old farmer named Ezra Cline. He was narrow through the shoulders, brown through the hands, and quiet in the way old working men get when they have learned that talking does not make rain fall any sooner. Beside him sat a faded orange Alice Chalmers WD-45 with a cracked seat, sunburned paint, and rear tires so old the sidewalls looked like dried river mud. The county weed commissioner stepped out first. Then came a seed salesman from Ottumwa. Last came Marcus Vale, a 32-year-old agricultural banker with pressed jeans, clean boots, and a truck that still smelled new. Marcus looked over the field, then smiled. "Ezra," he said, wiping dust from his glasses, "you know Foxtail doesn't pay a land note, right?" The seed salesman laughed. The county man did too. Ezra did not. He rested one hand on the tractor hood and looked at the field as if he could see beneath it. "That isn't Foxtail," he said. Marcus smiled wider. "Looks like weeds from the road." Ezra turned toward him. "That's because the road doesn't show you the roots." Nobody understood what he meant. Not yet. That summer, southern Iowa was drying out so hard that fence posts leaned loose in the ground. Corn leaves were rolling into gray-green spears before noon. Soybeans looked burned at the edges. Pastures had turned the color of old rope. Men who had borrowed for bigger planters, bigger chemical programs, and bigger irrigation pumps were already asking banks for another season of patience. But Ezra Cline's so-called weed field stayed green. Not pale green, not lucky green, deep green, as if the drought had somehow missed his 38 acres and punished everybody else. That was why Marcus had come, not to learn, to prove the old man had lost control of his farm. Ezra bought that farm in March of 1958, after 15 years of renting ground nobody else wanted. It sat on the south edge of Appanoose County, where the soil could be generous in April and cruel by August. The top layer was dark and promising. Beneath it was tight clay, hardpan, and old prairie memory buried under decades of plowing. Ezra knew that ground better than he knew most people. By 22, he could push a spade into a field, smell the dirt on the blade, and tell whether the roots below still had moisture. By 35, he could name which low spots would flood before a storm even crossed the county line. He did not call it talent. He called it paying attention. His wife Mabel paid attention too. She kept rainfall records in blue school notebooks from the year they moved in until the spring her hands became too weak to hold a pencil. Every storm, every frost, every week when the sky stayed empty. After Mabel died in 1982, Ezra kept the notebooks on the kitchen table. People assumed it was grief. It was more than that. It was research. Marcus Vale did not think of Ezra as a researcher. Marcus thought of him as a problem account. He had a degree, a calculator, and a file cabinet full of loan projections showing that modern agriculture rewarded scale. More acres, more chemicals, more horsepower, more yield per acre if the weather cooperated. Ezra had none of that. He still ran a two-bottom plow when most neighbors had moved on. He sharpened cultivator shovels with a bench grinder old enough to have a cloth cord. He patched hydraulic hoses with fittings saved in coffee cans. In town, younger farmers called him a relic. Some said it kindly, most did not, but none of them forgot 1983. That year, while several farms lost half their beans, Ezra still cut hay off a field everyone else said was too dry to bother with. Nobody knew exactly how. They only knew he had done it. Then, in the spring of 1986, Ezra stopped planting the south field and market crops altogether. That was when the talk started. No rows appeared, no planter marks, no clean stand of corn. Instead, by June, strange plants spread across the field like a green bruise. Neighbors saw seed heads along the fence and complained. One man claimed Ezra's weeds were crossing into his ditch. Another said the old farmer had finally gone broke. Marcus heard all of it. By the time the county van arrived in July of 1988, people in town were not asking whether Ezra's field should be cut down. They were asking why nobody had forced him to cut it already. The weed commissioner unfolded a clipboard. "Ezra," he said, "we've got multiple complaints. If this is unmanaged growth, we need it mowed before seed drop." Ezra looked at the paper, then at the field. "No." Marcus blinked. "No? No." The seed salesman chuckled under his breath. "You planning to sell this mess?" Ezra reached into the breast pocket of his faded work shirt and pulled out a folded envelope. He handed it to Marcus. The banker took it carelessly at first. Then his face changed. The top page carried a lab stamp from Ames. Below it were soil organic matter tests, moisture retention numbers, forage protein analysis, and a root profile chart from a sample trench on Ezra's south field. Marcus read the first line fast, then slower. Then he stopped at one number circled in pencil. 19.4 feet. That was the measured depth reached by the deepest roots in the sample stand. He looked up. The laughter was gone. "What is this?" Ezra pointed at the field. "My water." The county man stepped closer. "Those are roots?" "Some of them." Marcus looked back at the report. The plants were not foxtail. They were not ragweed. They were a managed prairie forage stand made from eastern gamagrass, big bluestem, Illinois bundleflower, prairie clover, and 2 local legumes Ezra had collected from old fence rows and abandoned pastures for years. The report described the system as unusually drought-tolerant, unusually deep-rooted, unusually stable under heat. Marcus stared across the field again, and for the first time he saw something other than disorder. He saw design. Ezra had spent nearly 7 years building it, quietly, coffee can by coffee can, season by season. Let me tell you about the drought of 1956. Ezra almost never mentioned it, but old farmers in Appanoose County remembered. Ponds shrank into mud bowls. Hay wagons went out half empty. Wells failed. Families stretched potatoes and canned peaches through winters that felt longer than the calendar allowed. Ezra lost most of his corn that year, but he noticed something along the ditches. The corn failed first. The pasture grasses thinned, but certain native plants kept standing. Not all weeds, specific plants, deep-rooted ones. Plants that had lived on that ground before county roads, before drainage ditches, before anybody thought a field had to look clean from a windshield to be useful. He began collecting seed. Not for a project, not at first, just because he had seen something survive. Mabel used to tease him for it. "You collecting weeds now?" Ezra would shake the seeds into a coffee tin and say, "No, I'm collecting instructions." For years, he kept notes no banker ever asked to read. Rainfall, soil temperature, root depth, Which plants stayed green after 3 weeks without rain? Which ones fed cattle without burning out the field? Which ones cracked compacted clay from underneath instead of begging a plow to do it from above? Nobody knew the size of the experiment until Marcus unfolded that envelope. "Why didn't you tell anybody?" Marcus asked. Ezra looked at the men standing by the fence. "People don't laugh as much after they understand," he said. "I needed the field to explain it first." The county men walked into the stand with him. Inside the field, the air felt different, cooler, close. The soil underfoot did not powder the way the neighboring fields did. Ezra cut a square with a spade and lifted a dark clump from beneath the surface. Moisture held in it. In July, during a drought. Marcus crouched beside him, suddenly careful about where he placed his boots. "How much nitrogen did you put on this?" "None." "Since when?" "Since the first stand held." Marcus frowned. "That can't be enough." Ezra broke the soil apart with his thumb. "Enough for what?" "For production." Ezra looked at him. "This is production." That sentence bothered Marcus more than he wanted to admit, because every chart in his office measured production by what left the field at harvest. Bushels, tons, pounds, dollars. Ezra was measuring what stayed. Roots, moisture, organic matter. A living field that could survive a year built to kill it. Behind them, the Alice Chalmers ticked as its engine cooled. Ezra had bought it used in 1967 from a dealership in Albia for $1,175. Mabel had argued for 2 days before agreeing to spend that much money on a tractor with faded paint and a stubborn clutch. But the machine pulled, and Ezra trusted things that pulled steadily. Modern tractors had more comfort, more speed, more glass, more debt attached. Ezra did not hate modern machines. He hated the way men trusted them to solve problems they had stopped understanding. That WD-45 had no air-conditioned cab, no computer, no plastic. If something broke, Ezra could usually fix it before supper with a wrench, a torch, and a word he would not say in front of Mabel. It was not efficient. It was dependable. There is a difference. By the next morning, Marcus returned with 2 soil specialists from Ames. They were polite at first, then quiet. One of them walked 30 yards into the field and knelt for nearly 5 minutes without speaking. When he stood, his knees were black with damp soil. He looked at Marcus. "This stand shouldn't be this alive." "Why?" "Because everything around it is running out of water." Ezra heard him and said, "Everything around it was taught to wait for water from the top." The specialist looked at him. Ezra pointed down. This one learned to find it underneath. By Friday, the story had moved through 3 towns. By Monday, trucks were slowing down outside Ezra's lane. Farmers leaned on fence posts and stared. Some were curious. Some were angry. Most were afraid to admit they were either. Then came Roy Banning. Roy farmed nearly 1,200 acres west of Moravia, with new pivots, new planters, new seed contracts, and a confidence that entered rooms before he did. He was not a bad farmer. He was a successful one. And sometimes success makes a man confuse his method with the only method. For 2 years, Roy had called Ezra the weed professor. He said it at the feed store. He said it at the co-op. He said it loudest when Marcus was there. One afternoon in late July, Ezra walked into Harlan's Feed and Supply to buy baling twine and a set of fuel filters. Roy was standing by the counter with 4 younger farmers talking about insurance adjusters and dryland losses. He saw Ezra and grinned. "Well, boys," Roy said, "the Prairie doctor is here." The younger men laughed. Ezra kept walking. Roy raised his coffee cup. "You figure out how to combine thistles yet?" More laughter. Ezra set his filters on the counter. Then he turned. "When the pumps stop," Ezra said, "you'll find out what your roots are worth." Roy's smile hardened. "My pumps aren't stopping." Ezra nodded. "I hope not." 3 days later, a transformer outside Centerville failed during peak irrigation load. Some farms got power back by morning, others waited. Roy's south pivot sat still for almost 3 days under 102-degree heat. By the time the motors came back, the top leaves on his corn had fired brown. Ezra's field did not change color. On the fourth evening, Roy drove to Ezra's farm alone. No audience, no jokes. Marcus happened to be there, reviewing moisture readings by the machine shed, when Roy climbed out of his truck and stood at the edge of the green field. He held his cap in both hands. "You knew this would happen." Ezra wiped grease from a cultivator shank. "No," he said. Roy looked at him. Ezra folded the rag once. "I knew something would." That was the line Marcus remembered for the rest of his life, because modern farming had taught him to help men win good years harder. Ezra had been building a farm that could survive bad years longer. Those are not the same thing. Attention came fast after that. A local reporter filmed Ezra pulling a root crown from a trench behind the barn. A radio station sent a man who wore dress shoes into the field and nearly lost one in the soft edge of a test pit. University staff returned with sampling tubes, cameras, and more questions than Ezra had patience for. The field became famous before anyone had decided whether it was legal. That was the dangerous part. In August, a letter arrived from the state agriculture office. Marcus was on the porch when Ezra opened it. The paper said the south field could be classified as an unmanaged seed source until additional review. Temporary containment was being considered. If the panel found risk of invasive spread, Ezra might be ordered to mow, disc, or chemically terminate the stand before full seed maturity. Marcus read it twice. They want to destroy it. Ezra folded the letter along its original crease. They want to control what they don't understand. "Aren't you angry?" Ezra looked toward the field. "Anger grows fast," he said. "Doesn't mean it's useful." The hearing was set for September 6th in Des Moines. In the 2 weeks before it, Appanoose County did something nobody expected. It changed signs. Farmers who had laughed began signing letters. A cattleman who once complained about Ezra's fence line brought feedlot weight records showing Ezra's forage held condition better than conventional hay during dry weeks. The soil specialists sent emergency statements. Even Roy Banning spent 3 nights in Ezra's machine shed helping label root samples, moisture charts, and Mabel's rainfall notebooks. There was no speech about forgiveness, no dramatic handshake. Just 2 men under a bare bulb writing dates on jars of dirt. That is how apology often looks in farm country. Work first, words later. On the morning of the hearing, Ezra loaded the Alice Chalmers onto a flatbed behind his old Chevrolet. Marcus asked why he was bringing the tractor. Ezra tightened the chain across the rear axle. "Because they need to see what kind of thinking built the field." The hearing room in Des Moines was too clean for the subject being discussed. Fluorescent lights, brown tables, men in jackets who had never had dust cake behind their ears. Consultants questioned seed spread. Chemical representatives questioned the measurements. One official called the project unverified nostalgia. Ezra listened without interrupting. For nearly 4 hours, people talked about his land as if he were not in the room. Then the chair asked whether he had anything to add. Ezra stood slowly. He did not bring a speech. He brought Mabel's notebooks. He set them on the table one at a time. 30 years of rain, drought, frost, and late storms. Then he held up a photograph of his south field from 1986 when the stand looked thin enough to embarrass him. Beside it, he placed a photograph from August 1988, taken the same direction from the same fence post. Brown farms on 3 sides, green in the middle. "This is not nostalgia," Ezra said. His voice was low, but the room settled around it. "Nostalgia is wanting the past back because it makes you feel better. I don't want the past back. I want the part that worked." Nobody moved. Ezra pointed through the window toward the flatbed outside, where the old Alice Chalmers sat in the sun. "That tractor is 31 years old. It still runs because I can understand it. I can repair it. I can hear when it's hurting before it quits." Then he opened Mabel's first notebook. "My wife wrote down every dry spell we survived. These pages don't say drought is rare. They say it returns, over and over." He looked at the officials. "You built a system that treats hard years like accidents. I built a field that treats them like appointments." That was the moment the room changed, not because everyone agreed, because everyone understood. The final review took 3 days. The destruction order was withdrawn. Ezra's field was allowed to stand under monitored study with buffer strips and seed controls that Ezra had already been using before anyone told him to. By October, the Ames specialists had begun a formal dryland forage trial, based partly on Ezra's notes. By November, Marcus had changed the way he wrote loans. He did not become anti-technology, he became anti-fragility. He started asking farmers what happened if power failed for a week. What happened if fertilizer doubled? What happened if rain came late twice in a row? Some men hated those questions. Some thanked him years later. Roy changed too. He did not sell his pivots. He did not become Ezra. But he seeded native strips along low ground and stopped laughing at systems he had not studied. Ezra never became rich. A seed company offered him a contract that would have paid more money than he had ever seen in one place. The catch was exclusivity. Ezra read it once and handed it back. No. Marcus asked him later if he regretted it. Ezra was oiling the Alice Chalmers in the barn, the evening light turning the dust gold. "No point saving a method," he said, "if you lock it away from the people who need it most." So the seed work moved through local cooperators instead, slowly, imperfectly, like most useful things. Ezra Cline died in January of 1999 after feeding cattle on a morning so cold the barn hinges squealed. He was 85. At the funeral, Roy Banning stood with his hat in his hands and could not finish the story he had planned to tell. Marcus spoke after him. He did not mention yield projections. He did not mention loan programs. He talked about a man who had been laughed at long enough to know laughter was not evidence. The farm passed to Ezra's granddaughter, June, who kept the south field in rotation with prairie forage and grazing trials. The Alice Chalmers still sat in the machine shed, still wearing faded orange paint, still starting on the second pull of the choke when the weather was kind. On the dashboard, June taped one sentence from Ezra's old notebook. "Not everything that looks idle is wasting time." By 2014, farmers who had never met Ezra were walking test plots that looked a lot like the one Appanoose County once wanted mowed down. They spoke of root architecture, soil carbon, drought tolerance, infiltration, resilience. New words for an old lesson. A field is not healthy because it looks clean from the road. A machine is not obsolete because it runs slowly, and a quiet man is not wrong because louder men agree before he does. Preparation looks strange right up to the season it saves you.